Medical examiners, have you ever lied to someone about cause of death? Why? Story 1. There are no rules pertaining to that. Sometimes I will dispose of a suicide note if I think it's going to ruin someone's life. And a surprising amount of people die while having sex, and not always with their spouse. When that happens, I simply tell the family that the person died of a cardiac event at X location. I don't mention that they were having sex unless for some circumstantial reason I have to. Story 2. I don't know the specifics regarding the case of your mom, but quite a bit goes into it. Age, recent medical history, visual examination of the body, etc. In the case where I have someone who abused alcohol, who was found dead, I'll examine the body on scene, and also at my office, or at a funeral home. There are certain things I look for, that sometimes tell me what organs might have failed. I also gather any prescriptions the person was currently prescribed, and I call each doctor that has prescribed them something. Usually after all of this, I can establish a probable cause of death. In the event where I know there was no foul play, but the person was generally unhealthy and had some medical ailments, we can determine that a cardiac arrhythmia was likely produced by the medical ailments in conjunction with alcoholism. It's not always an exact science. In that case, I always take blood and run a toxicology test. Story 3. In this case, the coroner has no way of determining if she overdosed on pills and alcohol intentionally or accidentally. If there wasn't a suicide note, the coroner has no way of determining if it was intentional or not, because there is no way to know what she was thinking at the time. In this case, I'd examine the body and rule out foul play, and then do a full toxicology. When the toxicology report comes back, we know exactly what, and was not in her system, and how much of each substance was ingested. Story 4. In one case, I couldn't figure out the cause of death and I reported it as unknown cause. Days later, the police found out the deceased had been choked with a pillow by her granddaughter, but there was nothing in the autopsy suggesting it, which is strange because asphyxia usually leaves some clues. In another case, we found a massive hematoma associated with a skull fracture in an elderly man. I don't know what the investigation concluded, but it was definitely not a natural cause of death. Story 5. Hello everyone, thank you for taking the time to read this. I have a very important question. For context, my dad died in 2023. He suffered a single stab wound to the left side of the chest, in the third intercostal space. Both ventricles were lacerated, as well as the left internal mammary artery. He survived 10 days on life support before he was taken off. There were 2 other people at the scene. One claims to have been in the shower at the time. The other says he stabbed himself. It's important to note that my dad had recently suffered a stroke. He was having a difficult time lifting anything or using much force. His speech was also delayed. The coroner told us she did an autopsy, and the stab wound was consistent with a suicide, not a homicide. The detective we spoke to also told us an autopsy was done, and he agreed with the findings. He also stated that he had another medical examiner look over the autopsy results, and also agreed that the wound, quote, could only be from a self-inflicted stabbing. Well, after 2 years of trying to get the autopsy report, we were told there wasn't one, because an autopsy was never done. The knife has also been labeled as destroyed, and they won't go into detail as to what that even means. No fingerprinting was done, and the 2 people present were only questioned by the responding officers, not the detective. The woman who was at the scene claimed my dad had called a suicide hotline the day before, but his phone records were never checked, and she claims she lost his phone. She also claims he Googled how to kill yourself by stabbing, but also lost his laptop. My question is this: would you have done an autopsy? Is it normal for a coroner to say she did an autopsy when she didn't? I'm honestly at a loss here. Story 6. My 6-year-old son's father died a few months ago. I actually just posted about it a few days ago. The death is attached if interested. I received a call from the coroner a day after he passed, explaining that he was found by a young transient woman who stayed with him sometimes. He said that they were calling it natural causes. I told him that did not really make sense to me. He was 49 and I suspected he had been using some prescription drugs in the past. He then investigated and only found marijuana-related items. A few days later, I went to clean out his apartment, even though I had not spoken to him in years. He did not have anyone else, and I wanted to save his mom the heartache. What I found was deeply disturbing. It looked like a heavily cluttered apartment, just packed full of unused items, mannequin parts, bike and scooter parts, spray paint, in a hoarder style. Within minutes, I started finding drug paraphernalia, and supplies. I was told he had won a settlement recently, so he had money and no bills, because Veteran Affairs was paying for everything. I was completely baffled that the coroner could have missed this. It was all out in the open. I called him back and told him what I saw and asked if anyone had even bothered to look for clues to his death at all. It was then that he told me that he did actually find drugs other than the marijuana-related items and had samples sent to the lab for identification. I asked why he didn't mention this and why he was leaning towards natural causes. He did not really have an answer. It's now been confirmed that his death was caused by his drug use, but I can't help wonder if they would have bothered to investigate if I didn't call him out. Story 7. My dad was a detective, and he's told me a few stories where things that were very likely not accidents but ruled accidents to spare the family the grief of suicide. One such example: a guy in town was found on the frozen lake with a gunshot wound to the head. Official report was that he slipped, dropped the gun, and it accidentally discharged, hitting him in the face. In the subsequent weeks, it was discovered he was defrauding his company of hundreds of thousands of dollars and was also under serious criminal investigation involving minors. The guy knew he was about to be caught and decided to take his own life. Story 8. There can be some twisted words for sure, but at different time and place maybe. My mother's side is very Christian, so when my nan on that side of the family committed suicide, the official word, even for close friends and family, and especially at the funeral, was that she died of a natural cause. However, on the hush side of things, the very close family knows she committed suicide, but no one talks about it that way. I was told in confidence what we all knew, but except that one time, everyone talks about it as a natural cause. Real weird and dumb. This to say that police and coroners might not be the only ones to hide suicide, if at all, depending on the country's ethics/corruption, and what is at stake on the matter, I guess. Edit. Grammar. Story 9. Just curious if we picked the worst funeral home, or if these things happen. My dad died coming up on 2 years ago. He had wanted his body to be donated to science. The funeral home director told us he had an autopsy done and therefore couldn't be donated to science. So we ended up cremating him. We never saw his body but instead saw a photo of him. I saw it first and told my mom she probably didn't want to look. Among other details, his tongue was sticking out. The funeral director actually said he looked good, considering he had an autopsy done. And so we had him cremated and weeks later go to pick up the death certificate and it turns out he never had an autopsy done. I just don't understand how this was overlooked. Story 10. My brother died years ago. Since he was in his 20s and was found alone, there was a police investigation. They asked questions about his mental health, if he could have suicided, etc., and my mom was torn up saying he would never, and she couldn't live with herself if he had. It was ruled an accident, and the investigation was closed. About a week later I was cleaning out his apartment, and I found the note. If his death had been treated as suspicious, I would have spoken up so no one got blamed for something they didn't do, but since it wasn't, I never told anyone. I feel bad about it, but I chose to let my parents have the reality they could deal with. Telling them the real reason he died won't bring him back and will only cause them more pain. Story 11. My grandmother died by going the wrong way on the highway. She hit someone head-on, drove an older car with no safety features like airbags, and died instantly. The other driver was taken to the hospital with broken bones and was released later in the day. We assume she got confused when entering the freeway. Years prior, the way she went was correct, before the highway was widened. Last month, while going through my deceased father's belongings, my sister found a disc with my grandparents' medical records on it. We are curious family members, and went through them, hoping to read some interesting information, as well as more about our family health history. Instead, we read how a month after our grandfather died, our grandmother went to the doctor for depression. The doctor noted that my grandmother had said she had thought of harming herself in the past, but it was something her faith wouldn't allow. The method recorded in the medical records showed that she had contemplated driving into a wall or the base of a train, or driving head-on into incoming traffic, the exact way she died 7 months later. It has shaken my sister and me to the core. We are devastated by how extremely dangerous it was. She could have easily killed the persons in the other car. It is one thing to take yourself out, but to involve others is extremely dangerous. My sister and I have made the choice not to tell anyone else in our family what we discovered. My cousins have moved on. This happened 15 years prior and there is no need to reopen their wounds. Story 12. Located in Idaho, aunt died August 10th. We were told within 2 days She bled out internally following a surgery. The hospital already has an appointment with my grandmother to discuss settling without lawsuit in a month. We still do not have the death certificate, and it has been over 12 weeks now. There are no private coroners I am able to find in my state. Another aunt called the coroner and was told a mistake had been made. They're still investigating an MSA that they'll see what's taking so long. We were told it would take 6 weeks. My state's laws on this are kind of vague, but any timeline I find is less than this. I recently saw some statistic where death certificates are wrong more when the death occurs in hospital, and it has me anxious. I just don't know what to do. Any advice would be helpful. Story 13. When my brother died, we thought it was a cardiac issue because he had a heart attack murmur. Unfortunately, we later found out it was an unintentional overdose. I would give anything to go back in time and not know the true cause of death. I have so much anger about it, it makes grieving complicated. He was months away from getting married, but the first time we met his fiancée in person was at his funeral. OP, I am so sorry for your loss. You are doing the right thing for your parents and brother. It must be a heavy burden to bear. Please reach out to a therapist to process what you know and how to grieve in a healthy way. I believe that you have given your parents and your brother's memory a blessing. They do not have to wonder what if, but please take care of yourself too. Sending you positive thoughts and virtual support and encouragement if you want them. Story 14. Hi there. Any help is appreciated. My mother killed herself a few months ago. I know this because she left a dated suicide note next to her bed where she was found. There was nothing nefarious that was obvious, but because of the note, they thought it could be a potential suicide when they took the body in for testing. She died on the 9th according to her note, and her body was not found until the 20th. A toxicology report was run where they tested her vitreous fluid and her blood. They said no alcohol was found, and no drugs aside from her 1 BP medication and 2 Xanax medication. Both she took every day, and they found normal amounts. The ME is saying that she had pneumonia, hypertension, and heart disease, and those were the main reasons she died, and that obesity and alcoholism, prior use, were contributing factors. So they are saying she died of natural causes. There is no possible way my mom didn't kill herself, for multiple personal reasons, but the most obvious is the note she left. Here are my questions. 1. Is it possible she drank herself into a coma? There was a partially empty vodka bottle in the kitchen, and the alcohol metabolized overnight, and later died while in a coma, and that's why they can't find it in her system. 2. Does it seem possible that someone could drink themselves into an unconscious state, and then lay face down, and the alcohol would be metabolizing but they would eventually suffocate? She was found face down in her bed. 3. Does anyone have any information on how reliable the tox reports are when there's a 1.5 week window between death and collection of fluids? Thanks, guys. Story 15. I'll back up a half step and try to address this in more general terms. These kinds of cases are difficult ones in the realm of forensic pathology. They are thankfully rare, but certainly not unheard of, to the point I suspect anyone who has done the job for a few years has come across one or had one come through their office. I.e., we have good indication of intent, but no identified or reasonably inferred means for that intent to have been carried out. So one can be stuck between deciding to use what you do have as a reasonable explanation for cause of death, which might mean a natural manner, versus an undetermined cause with inferred manner of suicide because of history/circumstances. Either one might be correct or incorrect in terms of universal truth, but generally neither one is wrong in the sense of doing a reasonable job with a difficult case. We occasionally come across dated notes which are irrefutably old. Toxicology does not always identify everything. Yes, there are a lot of things toxicology screening can and does identify, but no one tox screening/test can identify all possible substances. This is where investigation can be crucial, identifying possible substances, so the tox lab can have the best chance of identifying what is relevant to the case. There is a concept we tend to call a long lie in the context of some kind of overdose, where the body does metabolize some of the substance. Typically, not all of the substance and its identifiable metabolites are metabolized before death, for various reasons. This would be something very difficult to infer without exceptional reason. So the concept is real, but the likelihood is extremely low. Without going into detail, I can think of 2 cases offhand, in which there were multiple suicide notes but no good cause of death. In one case, they clearly planned a particular method of committing suicide by a form of trauma, but did not do so. Point being, it is possible for there to be intent to do one thing, yet some other process intervenes. Even though good evidence of intent usually helps tremendously. Story 16. Trigger warning. This story contains sensitive content regarding a death. My brother died when he was 19. This happened a long time ago, and my family has never been able to get anyone to investigate further or consider that it might have been anything other than possible self-harm. He was found in a swimming pool at his ex-girlfriend's family home. At the time, they had already broken up. We had hung out the night before, and I never had any indication that he was considering harming himself. That said, I am open to the possibility, but it seemed out of character. The circumstances of how he was found were unclear. There were objects in the pool that made it difficult to understand how this could have occurred alone. The parents who owned the pool were prominent community members. A medical examiner first on the scene was related to the ex-girlfriend. She told my mother that my brother had allegedly been using drugs, but no substances were found in his system at the time of his autopsy. I never saw any indication of this, and he had recently started a good job. When my mom spoke to the police, an officer mentioned that he and other responders did not feel this was necessarily self-harm, but he was not in a position to investigate further. Another note. The police department had issues with leadership soon after my brother's death, including corruption charges unrelated to him. Story 17. I don't know the context of your scenario, but my friend's father collapsed in his 30s from a heart attack, and my mother died by self-harm in her 50s. Both deaths were unexpected. My mother had attempted multiple times, and long suffered from mental health issues. I could have written the obituary either way. It took me many years to openly discuss her self-harm and mental health issues, despite being present and dealing with them while growing up. Also, just for reference, my mother's death certificate doesn't even say self-harm. It says kidney failure. Honestly, just remember your family is struggling a lot, no matter the circumstances, and sometimes in these moments, life is a blur for them. I was an only child, planning my mother's funeral and obituary myself at 24 years old. There was no one really to help. My mother was single. I didn't care what the obituary said in that moment. I could barely keep my own life together. Ori, 18. He was found on the ground in the parking lot behind our apartment building by a nursing student who called 911. He had been shopping. The groceries were scattered on the ground, and the gun he carries with him was also lying on the ground. They asked me if I'd heard any gunshots. They searched my home. They asked if we had any issues with neighbors. They asked if he was suicidal. They asked if we ever had any issues with people hanging out in the parking lot, or if my husband carried a lot of cash on him. No, I was not allowed to call anyone for hours. I sat there in his chair sobbing until I lost my voice while an officer babysat me because my husband of 27 years had just been murdered. The next day, the detective showed up at my door and told me that the coroner's report said he'd died of a pulmonary aneurysm. I guess a gunshot wound and an abrasion from collapsing on blacktop look real similar? Am I wrong to be seriously pissed off about this? Story 19. My mom passed away on the 8th of September this year. She lived with my uncle, who found her passed away in her sleep around 12 o'clock in the afternoon. My mom and my uncle both struggled with alcohol and hoarding, and they weren't always completely honest with others. My uncle told paramedics that he had not seen my mom all day, and he only went into her room at 12 to wake her and ask her to go to the store. That's when he noticed she had passed away. I was so upset about losing my mom that I initially accepted this story. My uncle asked to borrow my mom's phone for a few days, and I agreed. A few days later, I wanted the phone back, and a police officer had to assist in retrieving it. When I got it, I noticed that the voicemail password had been changed, and her pictures and texts had been deleted. I realized my mom never slept past 8 a.m., and some other details about the money in her purse didn't add up. Combining these observations with the phone deletion and other inconsistencies, I became concerned. Once I took control of the trailer they were living in, I found out my uncle had been storing or using illegal substances in his bedroom. I don't think my uncle caused my mom's death, but I do think there may have been involvement with substances that contributed to her passing. My mom was not the type to seek out drugs. Alcohol was her primary struggle. She was only 54. It's too late now. My mom has been cremated. It's been nearly a month, and my family isn't talking to me because they think I'm overthinking things. Still, so many details don't add up, and I have unresolved questions. Story 20. Hi everyone, I am not sure where to post this, but I just wanted to share something, even though I am a little afraid. I am from Virginia. but my father moved to Shelby around 2019 and lived there until he passed away. My father struggled with alcohol and often associated with the wrong crowd. In March 2023, my grandmother received a call saying he had passed, without any further details. The situation was unclear. As to my knowledge, the police did not investigate the scene. When my father was in his casket, there were signs of injury that were noticeable, even under makeup. One of the morticians also mentioned there appeared to be trauma to his stomach area. I was never close to my father, and just want closure for my grandmother's sake. I am also wondering if anyone has had similar experiences with the police in Shelby in such circumstances. Story 21. Setting the stage. The date is March 19, 2020. In the news, the U.S. Senate announces a $1 trillion stimulus package to aid the American public through the COVID pandemic. The Department of Education issues guidelines for online learning, and the number of COVID-19 deaths in Italy surpasses those in China. Of less note at the time, Gig Harbor, Washington resident Eric Hasselquist posts on social media that his wife Gwen has tested positive for the coronavirus. The next day, Gwen was found deceased in the Puget Sound. In the months and years to come, the case would receive little public attention. To those who knew Gwen, it would change their lives. Her obituary implies the virus as her cause of death, while the coroner's report rules it a suicide. Questions remain about her movements and the circumstances leading up to her death. Before we go further, I'd like to note my sources. This is not a well-known case. Locations Unknown podcast provided most of the information, cross-referenced with other sources, including police reports from the Pierce County Sheriff's Department. Gwen's disappearance. Our story takes place in Washington State. The Hasselquists live outside the town of Gig Harbor. On March 19, 2020, Eric posts on social media announcing Gwen's coronavirus diagnosis. The next morning, Eric posts a video from their home's Ring doorbell, announcing Gwen's disappearance and asking for help finding her. Gwen is seen leaving the home alone. She appears unsteady and confused in the video. Later that morning, Eric posts again, "Today I've watched the sunrise, knowing my love likely didn't get to see it." 6 hours later, police respond to a kayaker reporting a body floating in the water. Story 22. This will probably get buried, but since you asked. Trigger warning. This is pretty gruesome. In 2006, my dad, who was a severe alcoholic, was sent to prison for voluntary manslaughter. The victim was my grandmother, his mother. I was told that he'd pushed her and she hit her head when she fell. I believed this because, despite my dad's addiction, he was never really violent. Plus, he only served about 5 years for manslaughter, so surely it couldn't have been anything like murder, right? Wrong. A few years after he was released, my dad forwards an email he'd received from my mom which said, "Unlike the Menendez brothers, you used your bare hands." He CC'd my mom on this email so she could see that he sent it to me. My mom, bless her little heart, still hadn't quite figured out the difference between reply and reply all. So she responds to his email, thinking she's only responding to him. She tells him about how she'd been protecting me from the truth all these years, that my cousin had read the autopsy report, and how my aunt and uncle had told her to tell me what actually happened. But she didn't want me to know. I immediately realized there was more to the story than I'd been told, and when I saw the line about the autopsy report, it occurred to me that it's a public record I could easily obtain. So I drove down to the medical examiner's office and got it. Turns out my dad had actually strangled my grandmother to death while blackout drunk. I was shocked. My dad gave his attorney permission to give me all the other documents related to the case. I met up with this attorney and was given a massive stack of paperwork, police reports, court transcripts, even crime scene photos. He was originally charged with murder, but took a plea deal for voluntary manslaughter, aka a crime of passion, hence the very short prison sentence. So yeah, that was definitely the biggest family secret that I found out by accident. This all happened over a decade ago, and while I've mostly come to terms with it, it really messes with my head. The biggest problem with secrets is that they're not very good at staying secret. Story 23. Josh Clayton worked as a barman on the luxury island of Tresco in the Isles of Scilly. Near the end of his second season, he attended a party hosted by Tristan Dorian Smith. Josh spent several hours at the venue before leaving around 1:30 a.m. ahead of a 7 a.m. shift at the cafe. It was a rainy night, with no natural light on the paths from the shed to the staff accommodation. It was suggested he could have entered the sea of his own accord, either due to personal distress or an unexpected reaction to substances. His mother Tracy has never believed this. Just hours before heading to the shed, he had called her, excited about plans to move to Japan with his boyfriend after the season. Josh was known to occasionally use mild recreational substances, but never anything stronger to her knowledge. He was diligent and organized, aware of work rules, and unlikely to have risked being late for his shift. The next morning, Josh did not appear for work. Friends began searching, and his bike and personal belongings were found scattered along a trail near the shed. His phone has never been recovered. After 10 days of searches, his body was found on Teen, an uninhabited island near Tresco, by a yachtsman. Investigations followed, including interviews and toxicology tests, which showed alcohol above the legal limit. At an inquest, jurors at Plymouth Coroner's Court ruled Josh's death an accident, possibly caused by a head injury and difficulty in exiting the water. The Clayton family spent significant sums on legal costs and a private investigator to gather more information. They raised concerns about flaws in the investigation, including destroyed evidence and inconsistent witness accounts. Story 24. My husband died very unexpectedly while he was visiting a hospital for something incredibly minor. What the doctors did to him, I very strongly believe, is what killed him. They sedated him. Then someone else came along and sedated him again, all this during the doctor's strike. They didn't call the police, and they eventually referred him to the coroner for further investigation 11 days afterwards. The referral form has time of death 3:01. This is very wrong. I was at the hospital at 2 a.m., and he was already very dead. Fitbit data suggests he died about 5 past midnight. Obviously, that's not 100% accurate, but his heart data falls off a cliff, and something big happened around 11:30 p.m. I'm being denied any information. The hospital actually told me the police had told them they couldn't speak to me. The police told me that was nonsense. The referral form is signed. This information is true and accurate to the best of my knowledge, but I'm wondering, someone told me it's illegal to misstate the time of death. Is it? What does it benefit their cover-up to postpone the facts? Edit. My husband waited around, wanted to leave, was detained, restrained, sedated once, while being held down by security guards. Someone else came along, sedated him again, leaving him on his front. He was then left in a cubicle being supervised by an unqualified security guard, who eventually noticed he was not doing well. They did CPR, etc. All of this is captured on CCTV, and the guard's body cam has been looked at by the police to make sure it wasn't another George Floyd scenario. They've ruled that out. I don't have any clue why any of this happened. He'd driven to hospital, called me throughput the evening last, tried to call me at 22:40, was dead. Shortly after, they didn't call me till 1:30. He was dead by the time I arrived at 2, well dead, unfortunately cold hands and arms. They should have called the police. The coroner did 11 days after his death. They've lied, and I was wondering what the time of death anomaly means. Story 25. Apologies for how long this is. My main questions are at the end. Marked NSFW just because it may be a sensitive topic for some. My dad died by suicide when I was 14, 7 years ago. The entire time, his death has never made complete sense to me. I know he had a hidden lifestyle involving substances and violence, but dying by suicide seemed out of place for him. For years, I truly believed he faked his death. Last year, I retrieved his autopsy report and finally got his note. My family also began to tell me more about him and his actions throughout my life. To me, it seems a piece of the puzzle is still missing. I'm in university for crime analysis, and it's a subject that always interests me, so I feel that I'm constantly picking apart the small details. It doesn't help that my family has lied so much about him, his life, and his death. I just can't take their word anymore. My dad was diabetic, taking daily insulin injections. He died by suicide using insulin, injecting many needles full into his abdomen at once. Most needles were bent, showing there was some force used. I started watching the show Dexter the other day. One of the crimes they looked into involved whether insulin was used to kill the victim, as insulin can go undetected, and the injection sites are hard to determine. Insulin overdose can cause cardiac arrest and seizures. Last fall, I had the urge to check his online obituary. There were 2 comments, one from a friend saying they'd miss him, and the other from Gary, simply saying, "Ice." I was confused by that comment, as I know ice is slang for methamphetamine and murder. And my dad never mentioned a Gary. Anyway, I left a comment saying I missed him and loved him, my dad, not Gary. Now, I just checked the obituary again yesterday, and the comment from Gary is gone. It says 3 comments, but it only shows mine and the friend's now. The ice comment was suddenly deleted after I had commented. Why suddenly years later was this strange comment deleted only a few months after I, his daughter, commented? This baffles me. Something is telling me that I need to see the investigation files into his death. I know they spent little time on it because he was known to police, and they labeled it as a, quote, mental health case. They were also fast to hide the note from us for years, only giving it to us after I found out about it last year and demanding to see it. I have written a letter to send to the police under the Access to Information Act, but I am having trouble deciding if I want to request photos. On one hand, it will allow me to let go of the thought of him faking his death, and the photos might have some clues for me to figure out what happened. I knew my dad better than anyone else. I was the only person he said goodbye to. But on the other hand, I don't want the photos to re-traumatize me. I don't know what the photos would be of, and I don't want to have the images imprinted in my mind. Anyone who has received the police files on your person's death, did you ask for/receive photos? Perhaps you got photos that did not include him but rather just of the scene. Did reading the report/files help at all? I feel like I'm spiraling and would appreciate advice from anyone who's experienced a similar situation. Story 26. I have been binging while I work. Listen to these 2 cases today, and I'm always critical of police, but especially listening to cases where cops mishandled or were complicit in targeting marginalized people. Mistress left the station in the middle of the night with none of her possessions and no ride, and a deputy left shortly after her but initially lied about it? Come on. Keith Warren had his clothes changed, every bit of evidence destroyed, his family wasn't contacted until embalming was already happening. His toxicology report was so severe he probably couldn't move, but we're supposed to believe he made that complicated hanging setup? Do these crooked cops just think people are really that stupid? I know the ladies are cop-related and all, but it's really hard to listen to so many cases or read so much about cop gangs and similar things, and just have any respect for any of them if they're not actively trying to expose that corruption in the first place. I cannot imagine what these families went through, especially given that there's not really any legal course of action you can take when the police themselves can't be trusted. Might have to break up my work binging with something more lighthearted. Thank you for including Keith in this discussion. I would like to highlight that in February 2024, the Maryland Office of the Medical Examiner reversed Keith's cause of death to undetermined, marking a significant step forward for my family. Additionally, I provided testimony in support of Maryland House Bill 969, which was passed in March 2024 and became effective on October 1, 2024. This legislation mandates that any police department in Maryland must investigate cases where the medical examiner's office reverses a cause of death. Despite this progress, Keith's case remains stagnant. Although it was reclassified in February, the Montgomery County Police Department, MCPD, has yet to respond to numerous requests to investigate his case. It appears the only pathway to compel MCPD to take action is by having Keith's case grandfathered into the bill's provisions, an action reportedly within the governor's authority. I have submitted multiple requests to meet with the governor to discuss Keith's case but, unfortunately, have yet to receive a response. Story 27. On March 24, 1962, 5 teenage boys went skin diving about 200 yards offshore Pensacola Beach. They went missing and the next morning one of them was found sleeping on a beach. The news articles of What Day, in which the survivor was formally interviewed, only mention the 5 being caught in currents and getting cramps. At least a dozen different news outlets covered the tragedy. Not one of them mentioned a monster. A body washed ashore a week later, which the lone survivor identified, and the cause of death was determined as drowning. The autopsy report didn't mention any injuries. 3 years later, the survivor's story appears in Fate magazine and tells a completely different story, saying that on that day he saw a long-necked, foul-smelling green sea monster, which resembled a plesiosaur, attack and kill them. The survivor claims both the media and the medical examiner lied to keep the monster a secret, and that he told authorities the monster story on day one, with the search and rescue director, E. McGovern, listening to him in awe, then saying he believed him but there is not much he can do. The survivor reportedly became very depressed when people didn't believe him, and when he was older he posted his story to various online forums. He also wrote letters to Loch Ness Monster researcher Tim Dinsdale. The 4 other boys were Brad Rice, Eric Rule, Warren Sally, and Larry Stewart Bill. They were all aged between 14 and 17. The lone survivor, Brian McCleary, was 16. What I'm asking is there any plausibility to the survivor's conspiracy theory about the medical examiner lying about his friend's cause of death to cover things up?